Welcome to Inside Politics with Kevin Klein, beyond the headlines, beyond the spin. Straight facts, sharp analysis, and common sense conversation you won't hear anywhere else. Let's get started.
Welcome to another edition of Inside Politics. I am joined by three of my Winnipeg Sun columnist colleagues. We have Lawrence Pinsky, KC, a former human rights adjudicator as well. Royce Koop, who is a professor of political science at the University of Manitoba. And Jeff Currier, a former radio talk show host and columnist with the Winnipeg Sun. Gentlemen, today I want to talk about something that I've written about an awful lot. My column was in the National Post last week. And it's about the Indigenous land right claim. So we've talked about the one in BC, and I tend to get the name wrong all the time, but we just spoke about it before we started taping. The Cowichan. Is it Cowichan?
It's Cowichan.
Nope. Cowichan. Thank you very much. My apologies for that. I want to play a clip here, a news report of a bigger land claim, this one being in Kamloops. Let's take a listen.
There are growing calls for clarity and transparency for British Columbians around all notices of civil claim filed against the province by First Nations claiming title. Keith Baldrey joins us with more on this. Keith, this has become a big issue, particularly over areas that include private property.
Yeah, ever since the Cowichan decision blew up, literally, this has been in the news and raising concerns about what else is flying below the radar here. Is that the only case? Today, independent MLA Eleanor Sturckel releasing another civil claim, this one involving Interior First Nations that's claiming the entire city of Kamloops, other municipalities, the Sun Peaks ski resort, all in a bid to stop the expansion of the Ajax mine. Here's Eleanor Sturckel saying it's incumbent upon the government to find out what else is flying under the radar out there. And Minister responsible, Spencer Chandra Herbert, says the government is opposing this claim and is insisting private property rights must be upheld.
The government needs to do more to engage with the public so that they understand the possibility of what consequences could exist from this type of litigation. First Nations have the right to bring forward these claims and to file these claims of title, but the government has a responsibility to ensure the people who it is mandated to serve are well informed of the situation and have an opportunity, if possible, to participate in that litigation.
The province is clear. Private property in any case in this province, it's our view that it needs to be protected, and it's our view that we stand up for it. We're doing that in the Cowichan case, and we'll do that in every case. While we also fulfill our obligations to acknowledge rights and title for Indigenous nations and work to do both.
Keith, I'm sure the Kamloops court action is a bit of a surprise to a lot of people. How long has that been going on?
Yeah, here's another parallel to the Cowichan situation, Chris. Cowichan one dates back as far as 2014. This one today, unearthed by Eleanor Sturckel, dates back almost 10 years to 2016. So again, the question is, how many other claims are similar to this that are circulating around the justice system, and how many other municipalities may be involved in? How many, if any, private landholders are going to be involved?
No doubt. We need those answers sooner rather than later. Keith, thank you.
All right, so now we're hearing of another one in Kamloops. Looks like that one started a long time ago. No one was told about it. We've talked about the fact that there's a couple we're aware of right here in Manitoba now. The most recent one filed in March of 2025. And we talked about the one in Quebec that takes up part of the Ottawa area, the capital region, and how they're asking for $10 billion. So I asked our legal expert, Lawrence Pinsky, to take a look at the decision and tell us what his thoughts are. Lawrence, we're going to start with you because this is getting bigger and bigger online. People are becoming more and more afraid, and it really is starting to make a difference, I think, when it comes to people talking about reconciliation.
So these are very complicated issues, and talking about them is like skating on very thin ice. This particular decision is 3,728 paragraphs long, excluding additional attachments. It is a trial that started in 2019, and the decision was rendered August 2025. There were 513 days of trial. There were 6 defendants, including never mind the Attorney General of Canada and the Provincial Crown and the Port Authority, but also the Tsawwassen First Nation and the Musqueam Indian Band. So these are all defendants who lost. So these are very, very, very complicated issues. And whatever I'm about to say, it does not in any way take away from the validity of the fact that Indigenous people in Canada were treated incredibly poorly by the Crown historically, and in many different ways. Former Justice Murray Sinclair wrote about it. I appeared before him as a judge. I knew him. There's a course that I started dealing with family arbitration. He spoke at it. I respected him a great deal. In what I'm about to say, I do not in any way take away from the fact that there are legitimate issues for Indigenous people and how they were treated and the absence of justice in many, many different respects. Having said that, there's a huge problem, and it's not just in this decision. There's a vein of cases that represent two fundamental failures in my view. One is the failure of governments to deal with this properly. These issues should never be matters for the courts, in my view. They should be sitting down, the government of the province. In BC, we have unceded land. So the issue of the province and the federal government and the Indigenous people sitting down at a table, it's a political problem. It should be solved politically. And there's a number of reasons for that. So there's a failure politically. On top of that, we have, unfortunately, judicial activism that really is part of the problem here. And they do it not for a bad purpose. They do it to try to do justice. But fundamentally, it ends up being hugely problematic because of the type of evidence that they have to consider. And as you read through these 3,728 paragraphs, if anyone has the time and the energy to do it, you see some of the problem in how the evidence comes in. Sociocultural anthropology, oral history evidence. How frail is any oral history evidence from anybody about anything? Look at any conflict, any reality anywhere in the world, and different people pass on their own subjective views that really aren't terribly reliable objectively. And I'm not criticizing the individuals at all. Their families have gone through a lot. I don't criticize them, but from a legal perspective, in my view, as we say, respectful view, it's a huge problem. These shouldn't be court cases. And then to do what they did, and I'm only talking about the Cowichan case, to do what they did, affecting title that individuals have based on really, I would say, it's got a rich legal vein, but it could easily have gone the other way. And you look at the document pursuant to which BC was admitted to Canada in 1870 or 1871, I believe it's clause 13 of that agreement, you can interpret that in different ways. And that's the problem here. I know I'm talking a lot in a legal sense, but you can imagine how complicated this is. I think it's hugely problematic. And a fundamental concept of fairness, natural justice, is not to affect the rights of other people without giving them a chance to be heard. And that's the effect of what happened here.
Well, and that's the legal effect, but I mean the personal effect and what it's doing in other communities and to especially the landowners in Richmond. And I assume that people in Kamloops are going to start having these discussions and, talking to their banks and whether or not their mortgages could be renewed or what will happen. The discussion, of course, is still ongoing in Manitoba about the tourist area in Winnipeg called the Forks, where that has been, claimed. I really think that my biggest problem with this is the fact that I haven't heard from any political leader yet, other than, EB has said a couple of things because, of course, he's in the courts, I guess, or the government's in the courts. So he's, allowed to say a few things. But I'm not hearing anything from our federal leader. I'm not hearing anything from Carney. I'm not hearing anything to give me confidence as a Canadian citizen, as a landowner, that is protected. And I think that that's what people are looking for, Royce.
Yeah, I think that politicians are dropping the ball in the wake of this thing. The Premier of BC, David Eby, He spoke to it. He said that the courts assured the BC government that the ruling would not have any impact on prior ownership of private property. That's a pretty weird thing to say. It's maybe something that could have been dealt with before the ruling came down. The BC government has said that they oppose any kind of resolution to these land claims that involves moving ownership, your private ownership. Well, again, it's not really in their hands, and the killer right now is the uncertainty. I mean, if it takes
Hmm.
8 years for this to get to the Supreme Court, what on earth is? I mean, we're actually getting credible stories now from Richmond that people aren't getting their mortgages renewed, like their ownership is in question. And so the thing to do is for it's really for the federal government to refer this to the Supreme Court in a reference case to get clarification. It sounds like they're not going to do it. I don't know why. It seems kind of cowardly to me. Like, this is a big issue. It's better for the federal government to do it, so they should do it. But they don't want to, I think, get involved in what is a very difficult issue. What's more likely to happen, although even the provincial government doesn't want to do this, they could send a reference case to the BC Supreme Court that would eventually make its way to the Supreme Court. But they're not even willing to do that. They just want to go through the appeal process. And so, yeah, I think political leadership, this is a new thing for them, and they're not rising to the occasion on this.
Well, fear is controlling them, right? Fear is a big part of this. They're afraid to say the wrong thing and then have the cancel culture club come after them. But I've spoken to, sorry, some people that are afraid of what does this ultimately mean 5, 10 years down the road? What if a decision is made? Do we pay taxes to a municipality, and do we pay taxes then to the Indigenous group that has treaty rights in that area? And it's interesting because those were just kind of conversations between friends. And I spoke to a gentleman that I have a lot of respect for. He's been very high up in Ottawa. Has done a lot of work in front of the Supreme Court and stuff. And he said that it certainly leans towards a system where there might be a double tax system. There might be a two-tiered tax system. It might be considered leased land like we do have in some parts of Canada. And I think that's what creates all the fear, and that's what's creating more division, and that's what's calling into question reconciliation, Jeff, because you and I would see it in the media, right? You see comments or on talk shows, you hear people talking about it. Everyone's trying to walk on really thin ice, but this is a huge issue.
It is a huge issue, and further to some of the things that Lawrence was touching on, the complexity of these cases depends on what side of the Rocky Mountains you happen to be on as well. In British Columbia, where there were in fact some quote, permanent structures, there are some legitimate land claims, but no treaties. In further east of the Rockies, and including here in Manitoba, there were no permanent structures initially, but there were treaties signed with First Nations. And as Lawrence said, it should never have come to the courts. I think about the former Capian properties, which is now in the hand, most of which is now in the hands of the Treaty 1 First Nations, should never have had to go to court. But successive, both Liberal and Conservative governments kind of dragged their feet on that property when that settlement could have been done by those governments, certainly much sooner than it was. So again, the compensation is going to be, if there is in a case of, here in Winnipeg with the former Capian property, there was a chunk of land that was surplus. It was available, and so it enabled that reconciliation. But what if you're in a situation where that surplus land isn't available, like quality surplus land? I'm not talking about the original reserve system where you shove 500 people up into some place in the north where there's no hope of ever any economic activity. If there's no quality land available near an urban center where some economic activity can happen, what's the compensation? And the usual question, it comes down to how much? What's it going to take?
Let's go back for a second, though, Jeff, just in terms of what we see at Capcom Barracks. Yes, part of the delay was the position of the government. Part of it was also where the different Indigenous Treaty 1 people were not able to agree on what was to happen.
Yeah, so that's fair. That's fair comment. Yeah,
both things were happening at the same time.
Well, I think of the five Treaty 1 First Nations. 3 of them are in second party management.
so but let me continue a little bit, because there's a lot more to this. And the judge herself talked about the fact at paragraph 3727. I'm sorry to keep harping on it, but I want people to understand how obscenely large this is and how it was in the wrong place. And the judge actually said that a litigation is the antithesis of a healing environment. So that's very true. She's spot on there. But
she buried the lead, though, right?
Yeah. but reconciliation is a two-way street. As any of us who have had any experience in family law knows, two people have to reconcile. There's an innocent group of people who purchased land and paid taxes. How do they reconcile? And what about the fact that they paid property tax? Do they get to sue the province now and the city authorities to say, wait a minute, we were purchasers in good faith. We want our money back if now we have to pay to somebody else. So the whole thing, in my view, is a disaster, and it comes back to this body of law that is built on a major foundational crack. When you look at the terms of union when BC joined, and it's paragraph 13, it doesn't really say, if you read it exactly, not from a living tree constitutional perspective, which means we give it modern interpretation to do what's just, but rather what those folks back in the 19th century meant when they wrote that. Trust me, that was not in favor of Indigenous people. That was against them. And so in putting a modern spin on it is problematic, and it results inevitably to the problem we see out of the Cowichan decision. Now, the idea, Royce, that you said really the government should be responsive, etc., this is going to take years to wind its way up through the Court of Appeal and wind its way to the Supreme Court, and nothing much will change in that time.
Oh, I disagree. I disagree totally.
Except for a few things. One, I was about to give you the exception. One is that the governments will sit around a table and try to settle this because there's huge risk. Two, people renewing mortgages will be at huge risk and face huge problems. So there are costs to this, but there won't be a resolution per se. And that's going to leave one side of the reconciliation equation in dire straits unfairly. And that's the problem.
But I think the problem that I see is that, and Jeff talked about it, we lost him, he's coming back in now. And Jeff mentioned it, and I think he hit the nail on the head. It's about money. Like that's what it seems to be about now. It seems to be about money. And really, it's part of that narrative that, we've done wrong. We were wrong for coming here. The people that came to this country were wrong. And we have, you have Indigenous people, and then you have Métis people, and you have Métis people in every province. But the Métis in Manitoba don't believe it. There are Métis in every province. And Métis, in its own right, is, an Indigenous and non-Indigenous person getting together. So I don't know how that gives you land claims, or all of it just seems to be part of this narrative that Canada started in such a bad way that we have to change it. And it comes down to money. My article and what I wrote and what I'm thinking about is that, I've talked to a lot of people, and I've been to one of the reserves, you fly with the fly-in ones. And I got to tell you something, if the government is spending $32 billion on Indigenous people, I don't know where it's going. So now we're hearing more and more about that. We need more money. We need this. We need more that, or these land claims. But right now, I toured. I got to visit a place, wonderful people, but the housing was atrocious. And I thought, where are the millions and millions of dollars going? I think that's part of this discussion too, because you've got Indigenous groups that were again against this decision. They're against this decision. But all it really does at the end of the day, I think, is create this divide in Canada that is going to be as wide as the Grand Canyon soon. Because if you look at comments and what people are saying, it is driving this country apart.
Well, there's a lot to unpack in what you just said. It's unquestionable. I think it's beyond any question that Indigenous people have been treated historically terribly in many instances. And you can look at residential schools, you can look at other things and say, you can look at the policies of the original government of Canada, the first one, to say this is very problematic. And there was a doctor, as we all know, who warned about that. At the same time, there is a question of management of funds that are paid over to Indigenous people. But there's also a question of, for example, a human right to water and clean water, drinkable water. And lots of these, it's fewer now in fairness, but historically, many of these reserves did not have clean drinking water. Look at Roostertown in Manitoba and Winnipeg. It was a Métis settlement where Grant Park, now a mall, is and lots of development. And they were kicked off. The land was expropriated. The families were not compensated fairly. These are just facts. But it's also a fact, Kevin, as you pointed out, that billions of dollars have been going for years. And there's some problem in how it was managed. When Mr. Harper tried to enact some legislation, well, he did, or tried to demand accountability, that was seen as an intrusion on Indigenous rights, and maybe it was. But then I would have hoped that there would have been an internal, much as there's for child welfare, an internal system demanded by Indigenous people from Indigenous people to say, we need accountability ourselves as band members. And maybe that's happening and it isn't being put out there in the press. Maybe it isn't.
Well, I've got an article on Sunday in the Winnipeg Sun that features two Indigenous people from two different communities starting to challenge where all the money is going. And they're giving evidence.
That's good.
And they're doing that on social media, which is a great start. But I think the part that I'm trying to get at is I understand everything that you're saying. And it'll go back to my original point, is that we have no leadership here. We're just dividing the country. And politicians feel the need to say everything that you're saying. Yes, it was bad. This was bad. That was bad. But that was then, and I'm not making an excuse for then, but that's how people thought back then. So yes, we need to, make right a bunch of wrongs here, but we need to do it together. And if we don't do it together, it's gonna destroy this country and it's gonna belong to nobody. And I know that that's a political thing, but I'm not saying it as, I'm not a politician anymore. I'm saying it because I mean it, that if we don't sit down and start having these discussions together, where everybody is treated equally, then I think we're going to have some serious, serious problems in Canada. And what I see right now is a lack of political strength, that nobody has a strength to stand up and say, enough is enough. Let's fix this and lead us, give us some hope on both sides. And I don't know how you teach that, how they're going to teach what's happening right now in 10 or 20 years from now, Royce. I don't know how they're going to teach that at university, what happened to Canada.
May I jump in for 1 second? I'm sorry, Royce, forgive me, and forgive me, Kevin and Jeff. That's what I was talking about, the reconciliation. And when you look at the Truth and Reconciliation report, it's written from a particular perspective. And it's good that it was written from that perspective. But reconciliation is at least a two-way street, if not a multi-lane highway. And I think that's the point, Kevin, that you're making. And I tend to agree with it. And why I started with saying these things have no place in courts. You're looking at hundreds of years of history, oral tradition that's faulty in terms of an evidentiary perspective, not insulting the people at all, but that's true of any people and anyone. And that's the problem. And it is a political issue. And it should be resolved that way, whether with more resources, more respect and accountability to their own people. All of those things have to be done. I will be quiet now. I'm sorry, Royce. You've got it.
No, it's okay. It's good. I mean, in part of the reason we have the situation that we have in British Columbia is because politicians, not really like for the last 30 to 40 years, just kind of kick the can down the road. And so now all of a sudden we have legitimate land claims that are going to affect built up, developed areas, and it creates the conflict that we have now. And so the way to deal with this is head on, and there has to be involvement from kind of the elected representatives of the people. It's not something that, the fact that it's now fully in the judicial realm, that's not a good thing. This is something that should have been handled by our elected officials. And as Jeff always points out, British Columbia is different from the rest of the country. There's that claim in Manitoba, for example, for the Forks. This is a very different kind of kettle of fish. I mean, I don't find that claim very convincing, to be honest. And so I would be careful about these comparisons between different parts of the country. BC is a different, very different legal situation than the rest of the country.
But it doesn't mean that other communities won't try.
Yeah, and I mean anyone can make a claim. I
Right.
just think we want to keep that in mind.
And I think that that's again gets back to creating more division, damaging what has started as reconciliation, and manage the only way to manage that, I think, and Jeff, correct me if I'm wrong, but the only way to manage that is through political leadership that unites the country and doesn't allow it to divide, puts their head in the sand like nothing is happening, or gives that same excuse that you've heard a million times from politicians. I'd like to speak about it, but it's before the courts right now, and I can't say anything. Which, of course, we know is a secret code
Yeah.
for please don't ask me that.
Yeah, this is, when it comes to land claim settlements, especially east of the Rockies, I think we do, and we have made that distinction, and I think that it is an important one to make, that there was never a sense, or in ancient Indigenous culture, there was the concept of property ownership was non-existent. And it was a concept introduced by Europeans. And so when it comes to what land is up for claim, we occupied this land for a time, but we followed the caribou. And so we didn't actually own this land. We thought of the land as ours because this is where we lived, and we were able to defend this area against other warring tribes. So we sort of think it's our land, but it's not nearly as clearly defined as your mortgage would be. Where the property delineation is very, very clear. You know exactly what the measurements of your property lot are. It's very much of a European concept. So I think sometimes when we get into these negotiations and these discussions, that we don't fully appreciate how Indigenous people view property ownership and land rights. That we kind of look at it from a European standpoint.
My question for you, Royce, is this: what if Canada had been? Because you don't hear about this happening a lot in the United States. So what if Canada was, became part of the United States back in the 1800s? What if Canada was founded by the Spaniards? We know what they did to the Mayans. They basically killed everybody. Back in that day, people were exploring. They were taking over more land. So why is it not happening in a place like the United States? It started to happen in Australia, but what happened there? Well, politicians took leadership. They got involved.
Yeah, yeah, it kind of raises the question that if we do end up becoming the 51st state, what happens to First Nations people here in Canada? That's a very, very difficult, complex question. I'm not qualified to answer at all.
No, neither am I, and I don't think any of us are, for that matter. But it is something that I think we have to think about, and there's lots being done. Lots of people talking about it now. And I know that the budget is a problem. Our economy is tanking. We have companies leaving Canada. We had a furniture company out of Ontario leave Canada. It started in Canada. It's going down to the U.S. In Winnipeg, New Flyer, a bus company, gave their numbers, and they're having financial problems due to tariffs and all that. This is just another, I think, thorn in Canadians right now that is tearing our country apart. So hopefully, Lawrence is right that it will take decades to make its way through the courts.
I didn't say decades. I said years.
Well, you said it's 8, 10 decades. But here's my problem with it being in the court, Lawrence, is we're paying for it.
That shouldn't be your only problem. The court is not designed for this. I said this earlier, and Royce said it. They like, when you look even at the testimony that they relied on, the oral history, as it's called, the ethnography, all this stuff, they use documents, frankly, that were never intended to be used as legal documents or proof of anything. And it's problematic. At the same time, Kevin, you raised issues of historical relevance in the United States. Well, there were wars between Indigenous groups in the US and the American government. We know that President Jackson committed a gazillion atrocities against Indigenous people. And so there's different realities. But the point I was making is the court is not suited for this, and it's a failure of politics, and it's also judicial activism, no matter how well intentioned, ends up in a bad place, and it makes bad for bad politics too, and that's what we're seeing.
Well, do you guys, just one final thought on this. Do you think it's going to have an impact on property values as time continues? Do you think this will have an impact on development, especially in the BC area? I did read where some developers were looking at building apartment buildings and such, and going, "Yeah, no, I don't want to get into this," and they're kind of leaving it right now until there has been a decision. So if that does go on for centuries and centuries, like Lawrence said.
Now we see the problem with the media.
Yeah, exactly. It could mean, housing problems. It could mean all kinds of stuff. It's just, it is such a big problem.
I will say this. I think this, if I may. I'm sorry I'm talking so much, but I'll say this. As a Manitoban, and this may be controversial, Manitoba and Winnipeg in particular cannot succeed unless Indigenous people succeed. But reconciliation requires all sides to come together. This decision, and I'm pointing at my screen where that decision sits, is not the path. And so will it affect property value? It could. We saw that fellow, and as I said when we talked about last time, I don't know what the story is behind it, if there is a story behind it, but he said that he couldn't renew a mortgage. Who knows if there's other parts to that story? I don't know, but it could be majorly problematic if that's the position banks, because banks are averse to risk. If that's the position that lenders are taking, big problem.
Well, I hope this has been a good discussion, and I appreciate, Lawrence, what you brought and the clarity that you brought. That was great. I think everyone had some really good points in this discussion, but I really do hope. I look every day on social media. I check the wires that come into the Winnipeg Sun, just waiting for the Prime Minister or somebody to get involved and say something and bring the country together, because it's just another the tariff situation didn't bring the country together like we thought it would. And the elbows up did not work, as Lawrence calls it. It was just the start of a chicken dance, which it's turned out to be. We've been called chicken several times, right? And this is another thing that I don't think is good for any of us. So I'll keep looking every day, waiting for some political leader to stand up and take a stand. And I recall being at an event with former Prime Minister Stephen Harper. We were sitting at a table, and he was talking about how politicians must take a stand. If you're not going to take a stand, you shouldn't be there. And I tend to agree with that 100%. Gentlemen, thank you very much for the discussion today. Thank you for your columns on the winnipegsun.com. For those watching, thank you for your support. Please like and share or follow our YouTube. Smash that follow button and smash that like button. And we'll talk to you again next week. Take care.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks for watching Inside Politics with Kevin Klein. Please like and subscribe to this channel and visit thewinnipegsun.com for more.